Mrs. Carter, before I read this final document, I want everyone in this courtroom to understand that what comes next may change everything, the judge said, and for the first time that morning, even my daughter-in-law stopped smiling. I sat quietly at the end of the long wooden table, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the grain of the polished surface. Across from me, Vanessa Carter looked as confident as she had for the past 6 months. Her navy suit was flawless. Her posture was perfect. Beside her, my son Michael leaned back in his chair with the relaxed expression of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. They had spent months convincing everyone that I was a confused old widow fighting a battle I could not win. Looking around the courtroom, I could almost understand why people believed them. At 72, with silver hair and tired eyes, I hardly looked like someone capable of standing against 2 determined opponents. The hearing had already lasted nearly 3 hours. Documents had been reviewed. Statements had been read. Lawyers had argued over technical details that sounded meaningless to anyone sitting in the gallery. Every piece of evidence seemed to favor Michael and Vanessa. Every explanation made me appear more isolated, more powerless, more alone. Even my own attorney looked exhausted. Robert Hayes sat beside me, his shoulders slightly slumped as he reviewed his notes. If anyone had glanced at our side of the room, they would have assumed we were preparing for defeat. Vanessa certainly thought so. She kept exchanging satisfied looks with her attorney. Twice, I caught her smiling. Once, she even shook her head as if she could not believe I had dragged the matter this far. But she was wrong about one thing. I had not brought this case to court because I expected sympathy. I had brought it because my late husband had taught me something important many years ago. The truth does not always arrive first. Sometimes it arrives last. The courtroom felt colder than it had that morning. Outside the tall windows, gray clouds hung over downtown Chicago, covering the city in a dull light. The spectators had grown quiet. Even the reporters seated near the back seemed unusually attentive. Everyone sensed something was coming. The judge reached for a sealed envelope resting beside a stack of files. My heartbeat slowed. Not faster, slower. Strange how calm a person can become when they have already lost everything they were afraid of losing. 6 months earlier, Michael and Vanessa had forced me out of the home where I had spent 38 years with my husband. 3 months earlier, they had convinced relatives that I was being unreasonable. 2 weeks earlier, they had nearly succeeded in proving that I had no claim to the legacy my husband and I built together. Yet as I watched the judge lift the envelope, I felt no panic, only certainty. Vanessa noticed the movement and straightened in her chair. Michael adjusted his tie. Their attorney leaned forward eagerly. The room seemed to hold its breath. No one knew what was inside that envelope except the judge. Not Michael, not Vanessa, not even me. I only knew that my husband had arranged for it years before his death. The judge carefully broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. Every eye followed the document. Every whisper disappeared. At that moment, everyone in that courtroom believed I was about to lose everything. And the truth is, until that very second, part of me believed it too. 2 months before that hearing, I stood on a sidewalk holding 2 suitcases and wondering how a life could disappear so quickly. The house behind me was the same red brick home my husband and I had purchased nearly 4 decades earlier. We had painted every room together. We had planted the maple tree in the front yard when Michael was 10 years old. We had celebrated birthdays, graduations, and holidays under that roof. Yet on that chilly Tuesday afternoon, it no longer felt like my home. Vanessa stood in the doorway with her arms folded. Michael remained a few feet behind her. He could not even look directly at me. I remember noticing small things. The wind moving through the tree branches. A delivery truck passing on the next street. The sound of a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Strange details become important when your heart is trying to avoid a painful truth. Vanessa spoke calmly, almost professionally. She explained that it would be easier for everyone if I moved into a smaller place. She said the house required too much maintenance. She said I deserved a simpler life. The words sounded polite, but there was no kindness behind them. Michael nodded along as if he were listening to a business presentation instead of discussing his own mother. I asked a simple question. I asked whether either of them truly believed I wanted to leave. Neither answered. That silence told me everything. I rented a small apartment across town 3 days later. It was clean and quiet, but it felt temporary, like a hotel room where someone had forgotten to tell me when checkout would be. The living room contained a second-hand sofa. The kitchen was barely large enough for a small table and 2 chairs. Every morning, I woke up expecting to see familiar walls. Every morning, I remembered that those walls belonged to someone else now. Weeks passed. Family members stopped calling as often. Some avoided me entirely. Others spoke in careful tones, as though they had already accepted the version of events Michael and Vanessa were sharing. According to them, I was refusing to move on. According to them, I was creating unnecessary conflict. I spent many evenings sitting by the apartment window watching traffic lights change colors outside. During those quiet hours, I replayed conversations in my head. Certain comments no longer made sense. Certain decisions seemed suspicious. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the pressure to leave had started long before my husband died. Small suggestions, casual remarks, questions about ownership, questions about documents, questions that had seemed harmless at the time. Then one rainy Thursday afternoon, my telephone rang. It was Robert Hayes. His voice sounded different. Not defeated. Not worried. Focused. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was. There was a brief pause before he spoke again. Then he said something that changed everything. He told me he had found a record that should not have existed. And for the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. For several seconds after Robert spoke, I simply sat there staring at the rain sliding down the apartment window. Cars moved through the wet streets below, their headlights reflecting across the pavement like streaks of gold. The city continued as if nothing had changed. Yet something had changed. I could hear it in Robert's voice. During the months since my husband passed away, every conversation with lawyers had carried the same tone. Careful, cautious, discouraging. This call was different. Robert told me he wanted to meet in person the next morning. He would not explain details over the telephone. He only repeated that a record had surfaced during a routine archive review. After we ended the call, I barely slept. I made tea around midnight, then another cup at 2 in the morning. My small apartment felt even quieter than usual. The refrigerator hummed softly from the kitchen. Rain tapped against the glass. I kept thinking about my husband, Thomas. He had always been meticulous. Every receipt had a place. Every file had a label. Every important document was stored with care. If Robert had found something, it was not an accident. The next morning, I arrived at his office 15 minutes early. The receptionist offered coffee. I declined. My stomach was too unsettled. Robert eventually appeared carrying a thin folder under his arm. He led me into a conference room and closed the door behind us. Then he placed the folder on the table between us. It looked ordinary, a simple brown file. Yet the expression on his face told me otherwise. He opened it carefully and slid a document toward me. At first glance, I did not understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed a signature. My signature. Except it was not mine. The shape was similar. The style was close. But it was wrong. Certain letters curved differently. The spacing was inconsistent. I had signed thousands of papers throughout my life. I recognized my own handwriting instantly. This was an imitation. A good one. But still an imitation. Robert remained silent while I studied the page. Eventually I looked up. He nodded slowly. The document appeared to show that I had voluntarily surrendered certain ownership interests shortly after Thomas passed away. According to the date printed at the bottom, the paperwork had been completed only 3 weeks after the funeral. 3 weeks. I could barely remember eating regular meals during that period. The idea that I had calmly signed away important rights was absurd. My hands felt cold. Suddenly, several conversations from the past year returned to me. Vanessa asking unusual questions about legal paperwork. Michael insisting certain documents required urgent signatures. Requests that had seemed insignificant at the time now carried a different weight. Robert leaned forward. Then he told me something else. This questionable signature was not the only problem. During his review, he had discovered references to additional records that were missing entirely. Not misplaced. Missing. Someone had removed them. As I sat there absorbing the news, a realization settled heavily over me. I was no longer dealing with family disagreements or misunderstandings. Someone had been carefully building a story, and for months, everyone had expected me to believe it. After leaving Robert's office, I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour. The city blurred past my windshield while memories surfaced one after another. At first, they seemed unrelated. Small moments, forgettable conversations, little changes inside my family that I had ignored because I wanted peace more than answers. But once doubt enters your mind, it has a way of connecting pieces that never seemed connected before. I remembered a Sunday dinner about a year before Thomas passed away. Vanessa had asked an unusual question about ownership records. At the time, she framed it as curiosity. She smiled and said she was trying to learn more about family finances. Thomas answered politely, but I noticed he changed the subject quickly. Later that evening, he sat quietly on the back porch for almost an hour. When I asked what was wrong, he simply said that some questions reveal more than the answers they seek. I did not understand what he meant then. Another memory followed. 6 months before his death, Michael insisted on helping organize household paperwork. He offered to digitize files and scan records. It sounded thoughtful, helpful even. Thomas thanked him but declined. That led to a rare disagreement between father and son. Not an argument, just tension, the kind that lingers after a conversation ends. At the time, I assumed they would work it out. Looking back, I realized neither of them ever mentioned it again. Then there was the change in Michael himself. That was the part that hurt most. He had once been the kind of son who called every Sunday without fail. The kind of son who remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and favorite meals. When he was 12 years old, he spent an entire summer building a birdhouse with Thomas. They painted it blue and hung it near the maple tree. For years, he could point to it proudly whenever guests visited. Somewhere along the way, that version of Michael disappeared. The change was gradual. So gradual that I barely noticed it. Fewer phone calls, shorter visits, more decisions made without discussion. Then Vanessa began answering questions on his behalf. At first it seemed harmless. Later it became routine. Eventually it became impossible to tell where her opinions ended and his began. That evening I returned to my apartment and opened a storage box I had not touched since moving out. Inside were photographs, greeting cards, and old letters. Near the bottom sat a framed picture taken on our 25th wedding anniversary. Thomas stood beside me smiling into the camera. I studied his face for a long time. Then I noticed something tucked behind the frame. A folded note in his handwriting. My heart skipped. The paper was old, probably several years old. It was not dramatic. It was not a warning. It contained only a few lines. Yet one sentence stayed with me. Thomas had written that trust is a gift, but verification is a responsibility. I sat there holding that note while the apartment grew dark around me. For the first time, I began to wonder whether my husband had seen signs long before I ever did. The following week, Robert and I began examining every document we could find. Not because we expected immediate answers, but because too many questions had started appearing. Missing records, questionable signatures, contradictory timelines. None of it proved anything by itself. Yet together, the pieces formed a pattern that became harder to ignore. One afternoon, Robert called and asked me to come to his office again. When I arrived, I found another woman sitting in the conference room. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, dressed simply, with a folder resting on her lap. Robert introduced her as Claire Foster. The name sounded familiar, though I could not immediately place it. Then she reminded me that she had worked as an administrative assistant at my husband's company years earlier. Suddenly I remembered. Claire had been quiet, dependable, and remarkably organized. Thomas trusted very few people with sensitive information. Claire had been one of them. She looked nervous as she greeted me. After a few moments, she opened her folder and carefully removed several photocopies. She explained that while organizing old personal records at home, she had discovered archived correspondence she had accidentally retained after leaving the company nearly a decade earlier. Normally, she would have discarded such material. Something had stopped her. As she placed the papers on the table, I noticed dates that stretched back years before Thomas became ill. Some documents referenced internal audits. Others referenced asset reviews. None appeared unusual until Claire pointed to specific handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting belonged to Thomas. I recognized it instantly. My husband had always written brief observations beside important records. Reading those notes felt strangely personal, as though he were speaking directly across time. Several comments mentioned concerns about access permissions and document security. One note stood out more than the others. Thomas had written that certain files should never be altered without independent verification. The sentence itself was simple. What troubled me was the date. He wrote it almost 4 years before his death. Claire then shared something she had never told anyone. During her final year at the company, she occasionally noticed requests for information that seemed unusual. Most came through proper channels. A few did not. She remembered receiving inquiries about ownership structures, succession plans, and restricted records. At the time, she assumed the requests were routine. Looking back, she was no longer certain. I sat quietly while she spoke. Outside the conference room window, the afternoon sun reflected off neighboring buildings. People hurried along the sidewalks below, unaware that my understanding of the past was changing with every passing minute. Then Claire revealed one final detail. A few months before Thomas retired from daily operations, he instructed her to create duplicate inventories of several sensitive files. Not copies of the files themselves. Inventories. Records proving those files existed. According to company procedures, those inventories should still have been stored somewhere. Yet when Robert searched for them, they were gone. Completely gone. The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then I looked down at the papers spread across the table and realized something unsettling. Whoever removed those records knew exactly what they were looking for, and that meant this had never been an impulsive decision. It had been a plan. That night, I returned home, carrying copies of the documents Claire had shared. I spread them across my small kitchen table and studied them one by one. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of a wall clock above the refrigerator. Hours passed. Outside, traffic faded and the city settled into darkness. Yet I remained at the table, tracing dates, signatures, and notes with growing unease. The more I examined the records, the clearer one fact became. Thomas had anticipated a problem. Maybe not the exact events unfolding now, but something close enough that he had quietly prepared safeguards. The next morning, Robert called again. His voice carried a cautious excitement I had never heard from him before. He asked me to meet him at a storage facility on the north side of the city. Apparently, one of the company archives had been transferred there years earlier during a building renovation. Most of the boxes contained ordinary records, financial statements, vendor agreements, routine paperwork. But Robert believed there might be something else hidden among them. When I arrived, he was already waiting beside a row of gray metal shelves. Dust covered many of the boxes. Some had not been touched in years. Together, we spent hours reviewing labels and inventory sheets. It was tedious work. At several points, I wondered whether we were chasing ghosts. Then Robert stopped suddenly. He pulled a thin binder from the back of a shelf and stared at the cover. I could tell immediately that he had found something important. Inside were archived inventory logs prepared by company administration nearly a decade earlier. Most of the entries appeared routine. Then one section caught our attention. Several records referenced a secured file category that did not appear anywhere else in the archive system. The files themselves were not present, only references to their existence. More importantly, each reference included a handwritten authorization code signed by Thomas. My pulse quickened. Claire had been right. The inventories had existed. Someone had removed the actual records, but overlooked the trail proving they were once there. That discovery changed everything. For the first time, we possessed evidence that important materials had disappeared after Thomas created them. We still did not know who removed them. We still did not know what they contained. But we knew they were real. Later that afternoon, while Robert made copies of the binder, I sat alone in a nearby office. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and stretched across the floor. I found myself thinking about Michael again. Not the man sitting across from me in court. The boy who used to bring home report cards and rush to show his father. The young man who once promised he would always take care of family. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. A misunderstanding. Some missing piece that would make everything less painful. Yet the evidence kept moving in the opposite direction. Before leaving, Robert handed me a photocopy of one particular inventory page. A small notation appeared beside one missing file. Most people would have ignored it. For simple words written in Thomas's handwriting. Store separately. Release if necessary. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I slowly folded the page and placed it inside my purse. Somewhere, a file still existed. And if Thomas had gone to such lengths to protect it, there was only one reason. He knew one day someone would need the truth. Over the next several days, Robert and I followed every lead connected to the missing file. Most ended in disappointment. Old addresses had changed. Former employees had retired. Storage records had been destroyed according to routine retention policies. More than once, it felt as though we were chasing something that no longer existed. Yet the note Thomas left behind continued to bother me. Store separately. Release if necessary. Those were not the words of a man creating an ordinary business record. They were the words of someone preparing for a specific possibility. One afternoon, Claire called with information she had almost forgotten. Years earlier, Thomas maintained a private records agreement with a small document management company outside the city. The service specialized in secure storage for legal and corporate materials. Most clients used it for confidential archives that could not be kept in standard company files. Claire was not certain whether the arrangement was still active, but she remembered processing invoices related to it. Within hours, Robert located the company. The business still existed, though under different ownership. The next morning, we drove there together. The facility sat on a quiet road surrounded by warehouses and distribution centers. Nothing about the building appeared remarkable. A simple sign stood near the entrance. Trucks moved in and out of loading bays. Employees carried boxes through security checkpoints. Yet as we entered the lobby, I felt the strange sensation that we were standing closer to the truth than ever before. The manager reviewed several records while Robert explained the situation. At first, nothing appeared. Then the manager paused. He asked for Thomas's full legal name again. After entering additional information into the system, his expression changed. There was a record, not a file, not a document, a protected release instruction. According to company policy, certain materials could remain sealed indefinitely until specific conditions were met. My heart pounded as he continued reading. The instruction had been created almost 5 years earlier. More importantly, the release conditions referenced legal disputes involving ownership or inheritance claims. Robert and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us spoke. The manager explained that he could not immediately provide access because verification procedures were required. Several days might be necessary. As disappointing as that sounded, it also confirmed something important. Thomas had anticipated conflict years before it happened. He had built a safeguard beyond the reach of ordinary company records. When I returned home that evening, another surprise awaited me. A certified letter sat in my mailbox. The return address belonged to the attorneys representing Michael and Vanessa. I opened it carefully at my kitchen table. The contents were exactly what I feared. They intended to move forward aggressively with legal action. Their filing described my claims as unsupported and without merit. Reading the letter should have discouraged me. Instead, it had the opposite effect. For months, they had acted as though victory was guaranteed. For months, they behaved like people who believed every loose end had been tied. But confident people do not rush. Confident people do not pressure. Confident people do not panic. As I folded the letter and placed it beside the other documents, a thought crossed my mind. Somewhere behind a locked door and a legal release process, Thomas had left something waiting. And whatever it was, someone had spent years hoping it would never be found. 4 days later, Robert called before sunrise. The moment I heard his voice, I sat upright in bed. He did not waste time with greetings. The verification process was complete. The sealed material had been approved for release. I dressed quickly and drove across the city beneath a gray morning sky. Traffic was light. The roads were still wet from overnight rain. Every red light felt longer than usual. By the time I reached Robert's office, he was already waiting with a large envelope resting on the conference table. Claire sat nearby, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. No one spoke immediately. The atmosphere felt different from our previous meetings. Heavier, more serious. Robert carefully opened the envelope and removed several documents. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Legal paperwork, signed instructions, inventory records. Then he placed a single notarized letter in front of me. The date caught my attention immediately. Thomas had written it nearly 5 years before his death. My eyes moved slowly across the page. With every sentence, I felt as though my husband was sitting across the table speaking directly to me. He explained that certain business and family assets would become vulnerable if key records disappeared or ownership claims were manipulated. He did not accuse anyone by name. He did not predict specific events. Instead, he outlined a contingency plan designed to activate if disputes arose after his death. The letter referenced additional documents attached to the file. Robert handed them to me one by one. Some confirmed ownership structures. Others documented protected inheritance provisions. Several contained verification procedures requiring independent review before any transfer could be considered valid. Then we reached the final attachment. The room became completely silent. It was a signed directive prepared by Thomas and witnessed by multiple legal professionals. According to its terms, any beneficiary who knowingly submitted altered ownership records or relied upon fraudulent documentation would automatically forfeit certain inheritance rights. I read the page twice, then a third time. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from disbelief. For months I had been defending myself against accusations and legal pressure. Yet buried inside a secure archive, Thomas had left a safeguard specifically designed for the situation unfolding now. Claire looked stunned. Robert leaned back slowly in his chair. Even he appeared surprised by the scope of the protections. The evidence did not prove who had altered documents. Not yet, but it changed the battlefield completely. Suddenly, the missing records mattered. The questionable signatures mattered. The timelines mattered. Every unexplained inconsistency now carried consequences. As the morning progressed, we reviewed the file in detail. The more we examined it, the stronger our position became. Still, Robert remained cautious. He reminded us that courts relied on evidence, not assumptions. We needed proof connecting the irregularities to specific actions. He was right. Yet for the first time since leaving my home, I felt the balance beginning to shift. That evening, as I returned to my apartment, I noticed something waiting beneath my door. A plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photocopied document and a handwritten note. The note contained only 6 words. Ask about the conference room recordings. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I looked at the photocopy attached beneath it. At the bottom of the page appeared a familiar signature. Vanessa's. The next morning, Robert arrived at my apartment carrying a copy of the anonymous note and the photocopied document. We spread everything across the kitchen table and examined it carefully. The signature certainly resembled Vanessa's. More importantly, the document itself referenced a meeting that had taken place nearly 8 months earlier inside a conference room at the company headquarters. At first, the information seemed insignificant. Businesses held meetings every day. Records were reviewed constantly. Yet the handwritten message continued pointing us in the same direction. Ask about the conference room recordings. Claire joined us later that afternoon. When she saw the document, her expression changed immediately. She remembered the room. Years earlier, the company had installed an internal recording system for certain executive meetings. The purpose was simple: accurate record keeping. Important discussions could be archived and reviewed if disputes ever arose. Most recordings were automatically deleted after a retention period. However, some were preserved if management specifically requested it. That detail caught everyone's attention. Thomas had always believed documentation mattered. If a decision was important, he wanted a record. Robert immediately began making calls. By evening, he located a former information technology administrator who had managed portions of the archive system before retirement. The man agreed to meet us the following day. His office sat inside a modest building on the edge of the suburbs. Nothing about him suggested drama or intrigue. He was calm, methodical, and precise. Yet as he reviewed the dates and references we provided, he became increasingly interested. Eventually, he confirmed that certain archived recordings still existed beyond normal retention periods because special preservation instructions had been entered years earlier. My heart began racing. For months we had been chasing fragments, notes, inventories, missing records. Suddenly, there was a possibility of hearing actual conversations connected to the events we were investigating. The administrator explained that accessing the material would require legal authorization. Fortunately, the developing case provided a legitimate basis for review. Several tense days followed. During that time, attorneys for Michael and Vanessa intensified their efforts. Additional filings arrived. Deadlines approached. The pressure continued building. On paper, their position still appeared stronger than ours. Publicly, they projected complete confidence. Friends and relatives who followed the dispute largely assumed the outcome was inevitable. More than once, I wondered whether we had discovered too little too late. Then Robert called. The authorization had been approved. Certain recordings were available for examination. I drove to his office immediately. When I arrived, Claire was already there. No one smiled. No one spoke casually. The atmosphere felt heavy with expectation. Robert placed a digital storage device on the conference table and looked directly at me. He explained that several recordings had been recovered. Most were ordinary business discussions. One recording, however, involved a meeting held shortly before key ownership documents were modified. No one knew exactly what it contained. We only knew the date matched critical events in our timeline. The room grew quiet. Outside the window, evening shadows stretched across the city skyline. Robert rested his hand near the playback controls. Then he looked at me and asked a simple question. Was I ready to hear what had been hidden all this time? My answer was immediate. I nodded and told Robert to play it. He pressed a key, and a faint hiss filled the room before voices emerged through the speakers. At first, the conversation sounded ordinary. Chairs moved. Papers shuffled. Someone cleared a throat. Then I recognized a voice. Michael. Hearing him unexpectedly sent a chill through me. He sounded confident, relaxed, completely different from the hesitant son I remembered. Another voice followed. Vanessa. The recording quality was not perfect, but every important word was clear enough. Claire sat motionless beside me. Robert listened with a legal pad resting on the table, occasionally making notes. The discussion began with routine business matters. Budgets, property valuations, administrative procedures. Then the topic shifted. A document was mentioned. Then another. Several references matched records that later disappeared. My pulse quickened. We listened carefully as dates, file numbers, and approval processes were discussed. Nothing alone proved wrongdoing. Yet the conversation revealed something important. Michael and Vanessa possessed detailed knowledge of documents they should not have been managing at that stage. They spoke about future ownership arrangements with remarkable certainty. More certainty than seemed reasonable. The recording continued. Then a third voice entered the discussion. I did not recognize it immediately. Robert did. His expression changed at once. He paused the playback and looked toward us. The third participant had been a senior consultant who no longer worked with the company. More importantly, he was scheduled to testify for Michael and Vanessa. The room fell silent. Robert rewound the recording and replayed a section. This time we listened more carefully. The consultant discussed procedural shortcuts. He described ways certain reviews could be accelerated. He emphasized that documentation trails should remain consistent. None of the statements sounded criminal or dramatic. Yet together they painted an uncomfortable picture. People were discussing outcomes before official decisions had been made. People were preparing pathways before events occurred. The recording ended several minutes later. No one spoke immediately. The evidence was valuable, but it was not the devastating revelation we hoped for. Robert admitted as much. The recording raised serious questions. It challenged credibility. It established timelines. However, it still stopped short of proving who altered documents or removed records. For a moment, disappointment settled over the room. We had come so far. We were closer than ever. Yet the final piece still seemed missing. Then Claire asked a simple question. Had every recording been reviewed? Robert checked his notes. Several files remained. Most appeared unrelated. One in particular was marked as a supplemental archive rather than an executive meeting. That classification was unusual. Curious, he opened the file. A brief description appeared on the screen. Internal review session. Restricted access. Preserved by special instruction. My heartbeat accelerated again. Robert exchanged a glance with Claire. Neither said a word. He clicked on the file. The playback window opened. Before anyone could hear the contents, there was a knock on the conference room door. An assistant stepped inside carrying an envelope. She handed it directly to Robert. He opened it, scanned the first page, and suddenly looked up at me. The court had approved an emergency witness request. A new witness would be allowed to testify, and the name printed on that approval changed everything. The name on the approval order belonged to Daniel Mercer. For a moment, I did not recognize it. Then Claire quietly inhaled. Robert looked genuinely surprised. Daniel Mercer had served as an external compliance consultant for the company years earlier. Unlike employees, he answered to no department and reported to no executive. His responsibility was simple. Verify procedures. Document irregularities. Protect records. According to Robert, Daniel had retired and moved out of state nearly 3 years earlier. No one expected him to appear. No one had even mentioned him during the case. Yet there he was, suddenly approved as a witness. The following week passed in a blur of preparation. Court filings multiplied. Meetings stretched late into the evening. Every document seemed important. Every conversation felt significant. Meanwhile, Michael and Vanessa appeared more confident than ever. Their attorneys continued presenting a picture of certainty. Publicly, They behaved as though the matter was already resolved. Friends who followed the dispute still assumed I would lose. Even some relatives stopped returning my calls. I try not to take it personally. People often choose the story that appears easiest to believe. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt colder than usual. Reporters stood near the entrance. Attorneys moved quickly through hallways carrying briefcases and folders. When I entered the courtroom, Michael was already seated beside Vanessa. Neither acknowledged me. Vanessa focused on her phone. Michael stared ahead. The distance between us felt greater than the width of the room. As proceedings began, witnesses were called one after another. Experts discussed records. Attorneys debated timelines. Documents appeared on screens. Hours passed. Then Daniel Mercer finally took the stand. He was older than I expected. Gray-haired, composed, and remarkably calm. He answered every question carefully. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Yet with each response, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. Daniel explained how compliance reviews worked. He described preservation procedures. He outlined safeguards designed to prevent unauthorized alterations. Then he mentioned something none of us had previously known. During a routine review years earlier, he documented concerns regarding access requests involving sensitive ownership files. The concerns had not reached the level of formal violations. However, they were significant enough to be recorded. A copy of that record still existed. Across the room, I noticed Vanessa shift in her seat. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Daniel continued speaking. He identified dates that matched our timeline. He referenced meetings connected to missing records. He confirmed that certain unusual requests had originated from individuals who later benefited from disputed ownership changes. No accusations, just facts. Clear, measured facts. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even the opposing attorneys seemed more cautious. Then Daniel revealed one final detail. Years earlier, Thomas had personally instructed him to preserve a sealed supplemental declaration in the event of future inheritance disputes. The document had remained protected ever since. My heart began pounding. Robert slowly stood and approached the bench carrying a sealed envelope. I recognized it immediately. The same envelope resting on the judge's desk at the beginning of this story. The same envelope everyone had spent months trying to find. And as the judge reached for it, I realized the moment Thomas had prepared for years ago had finally arrived. The judge examined the envelope carefully before breaking the seal. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the reporters sitting near the back of the courtroom seemed frozen in place. I watched Michael from across the room. He appeared calm, but only on the surface. His jaw remained tight. His hands were locked together on the table. Vanessa stared straight ahead. The confidence she had carried for months was beginning to fade. The judge unfolded a single document and spent several moments reading silently. Those seconds felt longer than the previous 6 months combined. Then she lifted her eyes and began reading aloud. The statement was brief, direct, precise. Thomas had written that if any beneficiary attempted to obtain ownership, assets, or inheritance rights through altered records, concealed documentation, or knowingly inaccurate representations, that beneficiary would immediately lose all entitlement under the protected inheritance provisions. The courtroom became completely silent. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that arrives when everyone understands the significance of what they have just heard. I looked toward Michael. The color had drained from his face. Vanessa lowered her eyes to the table. Neither spoke. Neither objected. The judge continued reviewing the supporting documents attached to the declaration. Dates aligned. Preservation records matched. Witness certifications confirmed authenticity. Years earlier, Thomas had anticipated the exact type of dispute now sitting before the court. He had not accused anyone. He had simply created a safeguard. One that could only be activated if evidence revealed misconduct connected to inheritance claims. Robert remained calm beside me. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He simply organized his notes and waited. That was when I understood the truth. The case had never depended on anger. It had never depended on revenge. It depended on patience. One document led to another. One missing record revealed a larger pattern. One forgotten inventory uncovered a protected archive. Every small piece mattered. The judge concluded her review and announced her findings. Several disputed transfers would be invalidated pending final administrative processing. Certain inheritance claims would be revoked under the conditions established by Thomas. Additional reviews would follow, but the central issue was no longer in doubt. The outcome everyone expected had changed completely. Around me, people began whispering. Attorneys exchanged looks. Reporters hurried to write notes. Yet none of it felt important. My attention remained fixed on Michael. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I searched for the little boy who once built a blue birdhouse with his father. The young man who promised family would always come first. I could not find him. Maybe he had disappeared years earlier. Maybe I had simply refused to see it. Slowly I stood. The hearing was over. As I walked toward the exit, no one stopped me. Outside, sunlight reflected from the courthouse windows. The air felt warmer than it had in months. I paused on the steps and looked up at the sky. For the first time since Thomas died, the weight I had been carrying began to lift. Not because I had won, not because others had lost, but because the truth had finally been allowed to speak for itself. And in the end, that was all Thomas had ever wanted.